Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Of course, the show where we take dives into little albums that are different for, whatever reason. So, today, I'd like to ask you a rhetorical question to start this episode off. What's the most devastating album you've ever heard? So, off the top of my head, there's so many I can think of. There's The Antlers Hospice, for example. This is one that breaks my heart every single time I hear it. As well as, Mount Erie's A Crow Looked at Me, albums of real artistic expression through really devastating emotions. But what about non-vocal music? Of course, some of the biggest examples we could probably think of would be like William Basinski's Disintegration Loops, or even The Caretaker's magnificent opus Everywhere at the End of Time. These are albums that they often come up in discussions of devastating music, for the right reasons as well. But today, I would like to talk about one that never comes up. An album that, it really flew under the radar when it was released. And it's easily one of the most devastating musical experiences I've ever come across in, my many years of reviewing music, even prior to doing this channel. So, when this album was first released, I had the honour of reviewing it for the website Echoes and Dust. And, during the time, I had this really deeply moving existential experience when approaching the album itself. And as a result, this episode is going to be very dark and uncomfortable in many places, so, proceed with caution. So yeah, let's get on with it. We're going to dive into something really harrowing and really haunting. I present to you the 2017 album, The Infected Mass, by Those Who Walk Away. So, before we begin, who is Those Who Walk Away? Those Who Walk Away is an experimental contemporary-ambient project spearheaded by one Matthew Patton, a composer and curator who's collaborated with a great number of artists across his career. And it seems that Patton's career genuinely sees him providing more of a platform for new and experimental works as a curator of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra New Music Festival, which has seen the works from, many works from the likes of Jim Jarmusch, Tim Hecker, Sigur Rós, Lee Ronaldo, and Venetian Snares, for example, as well as many, many more. However, amongst, his rather vast and, very different, style of artistic career and stuff. He's done many different styles of projects. Within it lies one particular album release under the moniker of Those Who Walk Away. And it's an album that had a really profound impact on my life when I first heard it in 2017. So, The Infected Mass is a 2017 album released on Constellation Records, the record label that's seen the likes of, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Do Make Say Think. We even looked at, two of their albums before, Elizabeth Anka Vajicic and Fly Pan Am in previous episodes. And yeah, this is one of those albums now. It falls into that small little category on Constellation Records, an artist, with just a single release on the record label. But what is The Infected Mass then? Well, The Infected Mass is a minimalist ambient composition by Patton that combines really ghostly strings and choral voices with music concrete concepts and ideas. Composed and arranged and produced by Patton, the album sees the use of two orchestral ensembles. The first ensemble features Elation Pauls on violin, both Anne-Alice Lavelle and Momoko Matsumura on viola, Mina Shung on cello, and Travis Harrison on double bass. And this was all recorded at Private Ear in Winnipeg, Canada. And so this orchestra is offset by a secondary ensemble recorded at the Greenhouse in Reykjavik, Iceland, which features Unas Daughter on ghost violin and ghost choir, Poran Oskmarinusdóttir on ghost viola and ghost choir, Margaret Daughter on ghost cello and ghost choir, and Borga Magnusson on ghost double bass. So immediately, this is a very interesting way to credit the musicians on this album, and it makes sense in the larger context of the album in terms of what it's presenting, what it's trying to do. It all makes sense. So yeah, the result though of having these two orchestras and such, you're getting this incredibly slow and haunting album experience that really moves along at a very slow glacial pace, coming across as a really profoundly emotive requiem, paying tribute to victims of plane crashes. So yes, there's an incredibly harrowing undertone running throughout this album. It moves from really quiet murmurings and drones that have been sourced from humming, whispering, and even the sound of human blood flow, to very tragic, melancholy string sections that sound like the saddest choir, instrumental choir I've ever conceived. But on top of that, though, this album is also punctuated by the inclusions of field recordings, samples from black box recordings in cockpits of airplanes in distress. So yeah, it's probably worth going into this album track by track. The whole album's made up of 7 tracks, and they all just flow seamlessly into each other to create this one long-form listening experience. And I have to be honest though, the whole experience though is one that is so difficult and so uncomfortable to actually approach. For me, this is akin to watching, really bleak movies, where by the end you're left with this really empty pit in your stomach. It's very difficult to find time to actually want to sit down and listen to something like this. But regardless of all that, though, I find there to be something really interesting about music that moves me in this very particular way. There's something really cathartic about, it's a very cathartic experience about consuming artistic creations like this. And although it might be incredibly weird, I feel like it's worth trying to talk about those experiences. Hence why I'm going to try to talk about this album in particular. So going back to the track listing, The Infected Mask, it opens up with Before the Beginning, which opens up with these really soft, airy drones, sounding sort of like standing in the middle of a field in the pitch black of night. There's not even a star in the sky, like all you can hear is the deafening wind and your own body just at work, sounding like the loudest thing you've ever heard. And it's a really slow moving piece that establishes the scene so perfectly before you get these really ghostly, ethereal voices that start to flow into the landscape. And there's such a really sad beauty to those voices, It's really powerful, it's really moving, and there's something so sad and bleak about the whole thing. Like, as an opener, this thing takes a really long while to sort of, establish itself, let it get across what it wants to, but oh man, it just sucks you in entirely if you just let it just flow over you, and yeah, it becomes incredibly powerful. So from there, the album moves into the second track, First Degraded Hymn. And this introduces the string section into the album, backed up by this really peculiar breathing. There's this, I'll mention it here, there's this really effortless glide from between all of the tracks, especially from the first into this one. It all just is so seamless in creating this entire narrative vision, and it's very interesting because by the time you get to the second track and those strings start coming in, you don't really notice that you've gone from track 1 to 2. It all sounds so effortless. But regardless, the track itself is further pushing this really incredibly melancholy setting, with the strings just pulling on the saddest and most somber of notes. But there's so much patience and restraint to the whole thing. It never climbs and soars like a traditional string composition would, if you can kind of think about it, but instead it just lingers on the most haunting of musical motifs. And as well, like, you'll see, in discussing motifs, actually, this is a good time to mention this one. This track kind of establishes a particular motif that carries throughout the entire album, I would kind of describe it as the hymn of the album. It crops up in the middle and the penultimate tracks. And for me, I'm pretty sure this is meant to be a haunting elegy for the victims of those tragic accidents that we're going to basically uncover on the next one. So yeah, track 3, First Partially Recollected Conversation. This is when the album introduces the recordings of airplanes in distress. So, yeah, I don't know why, but I find it really difficult to talk about. Like, I'll mention it here, in my original review for Echoes and Dust, I found it very difficult to talk about this, but it's a centerpiece, it's a focal point for this album, and there's a reason for it as well. We'll get into it later, but I'll try my best to just get through what I've written here. Like, I'll be honest, it's very difficult for me to talk about this album, to be fair, but that's fine. So, First Partially Recollected Conversation, you've got a further pushing of those really haunting drones that have glided in from the first and second track. And then you're sort of placed right into the center of an airport terminal, You can kind of hear these footsteps, these conversations, people, life just going by. And then you get placed into sort of the tower, the communications tower, where you get, the conversation between the airport terminal and the airplane itself. And it gets really difficult to digest here because you've got this really, bleak, stark reality of what is being heard in the conversation. It creates this incredibly disturbing, uncomfortable experience where we listen to the voices of real people who are essentially about to die.
We've lost vertical control of our airplane. We're at 23.7, request
Last 261, to the altitude you'd like to remain at. 10 Foxtrot, wind direct Oceanside. Alaska 552, descend and maintain flight level 240.
Descend and maintain flight level 240, last 552. 261, we're at 24,000 feet, kind of stabilized. We're slowing here, and we're going to do a little troubleshooting. Can you give me a block between 20 and 25? Last 261, we'll take that block, we'll be monitoring for you.
LA Delta X-ray, we do have that airplane quite high and up at 1 o'clock.
0 Delta X-ray, right? Just kind of keep your eye on them. He's having some pretty bad problems up there right now. As far as I know right now, he's intending to go to 17,000. Keep your eye on them.
I concur. He is definitely in a nose-down position, descending quite rapidly.
Okay, very good. Keep your eye on him. Alaska 261, are you here with us yet, sir? Army 500904, contact center on 119.05.
1905, adios, sir.
Okay, very good. It looks like he's turning over in front of you now, Scala 6154. You still got your eyes on him, sir?
position, I'm right abeam of 50 Delta X-ray.
Yeah, he just now hit it. We have the spot marked right here. Thanks, guys.
G6-152, American 161.
And he's just hit the water.
Yes, sir. He hit the water. He's down.
Okay.
And for position, I'm right abeam of 50 Delta X-ray.
Yeah, he just now hit it. We have the spot marked right here. Thanks, guys. American 161, contact center on 126.52.
G6-152, American 161. Center, he's about 2.5 miles off the end of Anacapa, just towards Point Mugu.
Okay, it's about 2.5 miles off the east end of Anacapa, was it?
Sir, that's affirmative. Actually, he's up the northeast end, probably 030 heading off Anacapa. There was a boat that doesn't seem to be turning around right next to him.
Roger that. 0 Delta X-ray. Do you still see the spot right where it went in?
And yeah, you can hear the professional panic of those discussing the incident. It's all currently about to take place before you get. And it's very scary though, because you've got this. As the conversation occurs, and you can sort of the reality of it starts to set in. You get this build-up of those airy drones, though. It really builds up into this tumultuous noise before it disappears. And you come to the realization of what has just happened. Essentially the plane has hit the ground. And those in the control tower are just left there absorbing the situation, discussing yeah, this is what's happened. And the stark reality of that, I find... I can't really put it into words. It's something so it gets me right here in this really peculiar way. And so, when I first reviewed this album for Echoes and Dust, I remember mentioning that I felt there was something really wrong about using the recordings, using recordings like these in a creative piece. But at the same time, there was something so incredibly important about what Patton was trying to do with it as well. Now, this is something we'll get into later, but I'll mention it here because this is the first instance of it on the album. But yeah, it's one of the most difficult things I've ever listened to, and I can remember when I first heard it, the impact it had on me just floored me completely, and yeah, you're just left there, really trying to take it in and it being so difficult to do so. So with that then, the album moves on to, the middle recording, I guess you could call it, Second Degraded Hymn. This is where you get a reprise of the hymn that we mentioned in track 2, including the strings and those musical motifs. However, there's something really off about this one. It features those same motifs, but there's something... It's very weird. It's like some of it feels so much more fuller and brighter than the first version on track 2. And then some of it feels so much more empty and, just empty. Such emptiness about it. And yeah, it's like certain parts are starker and more reduced, but as though it's all just crumbling away into this obscurity, whilst other parts feel much more at the forefront than it originally was. And again, while you've got this haunting requiem playing, you've got this airy drone that's been consistently playing throughout the entirety of this album up to this point. It's still going on, and it just sounds like wind in the most blackest, bleakest nights. And to be fair, by this point though, especially after the emotional impact of the previous track, first partially recollected Constellation, there's something so unsettling about the drones in this one. It just really places you into this really existential state of mind that's so difficult to actually comprehend. And you couple all of this though with the faintest sound of breathing. It's like being inside of yourself, I think. in this very bleak, empty situation, just trying to understand and comprehend everything that your brain just cannot wrap its head around. It's so peculiar. But moving on though, we come to the next track, Second Partially Recollected Conversation. And this reprises the same concepts and ideas from track 3. It places us right back into that busy airport. Sounds of voices, footsteps wandering around as we're giving another sample of a different black box recording. So, if you ever listen to this, if you haven't listened to this album before and you're interested in it for whatever reason, I would actually say go listen to this album and then maybe come back to the review at this point, because I feel like there's spoilers, being mentioned here. But I'll go into it anyway. I don't know about you, but there's something, especially after the really devastating nature of first partially recollected conversation. When it comes to second partially recollected conversation, I find there's something really tense and nervous about this track. There's this really uncomfortable level of tension, because after hearing that first one, we're literally expecting something awful and terrible to happen, And for me, you hear the control tower, the person in the control tower worryingly ask them, you can only make right turns. And that just sets my heart beating so uncomfortably, because, I'm just expecting the worst. There's something so realistic and it is real. It's a literal recording of this. And there's something so devastating and bleak about it, though. And, man, once again, though, this track does that thing. It does that build up again of those noisy, airy drones into this big, tumultuous moment. And when that happens, it fills up the headphones, and I get this literal rising panic every time I hear it. It gets really terrifying, and then it disappears. You're expecting the worst, but then the voices continue. And maybe things are okay with this one. It seems as though the plane has been guided back to the airport. Things are okay, we don't have to worry all of a sudden. But regardless, though, our emotions have been put up to that point, and even after the revelation of it, it's still held there. Especially with those airy drones and stuff, the motifs, everything we heard there, still holding on though, even after the conversation telling us that it should all be fine now. We're still held right in that point though, and you feel that anxiety still there, and I find it very weird though, like how this one kind of plays with emotions. I'll try and get into it later, but I find this one really difficult to put into words. It's a very peculiar thing that this particular track does. Very peculiar. And so with that, we move on to the penultimate track, Third Degraded Hymn. Now, once again, atop the empty, airy drone, you're greeted again by that really sparse requiem of the strings. And here it all sounds so incredibly empty and desolate, though. I find it's here as well. You can most audibly hear that choir. It was first established in the first track. They're kind of there at various points in the album and stuff. I'm sure it's there, but its presence is buried. But as this track's moving forward, the voices start coming to the forefront, just silently humming away, whilst the strings just sadly drone over the top of the thing. And for me, we've mentioned how the strings sort of feel more stark and desolate as those tracks go on. And on this one, Third Degraded Hymn, it feels as though the strings can barely play anything anymore. What sounded like a song in the first hymn sounds so much emptier on this one. It's so bleak, much more bleak and cold and empty. And it's like it can barely lift itself up out of the darkness anymore. It's just sounding so physically heavy to play just anything at all. And for me, I find I get really lost in a complete dark existentialism by this point. And with this track being the longest one on the album, only by a little bit, but still the longest one on there, and with it being the penultimate track, it gives you this really dark moment of contemplation for the entire record itself. You know, you're sat there and you're just absorbing everything you've been listening to, all the emotions you've felt, which have been, you know, almost toyed around with at times, you know. And yeah, you just got this vast empty space to just sit silently, think and consider everything. And so then you get the final track, after the end. 7 minutes of further contemplation as the elements just seem to drone out on loop, before you're greeted by those ghostly vocals from the very first track again. And it's here I realised that was an element that's actually unused on many of the other tracks, so it actually, you know, that particular ghostly choral effect, or whatever you'd call it. So it's acting as a bookend for the beginning and the end of the entire album, and I find it very interesting, though, like thematically how Patton has presented this album. You know, it's very, you know, prequel, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 kind of stuff, you know, and ending, of course. But, you know, regardless of that, I find, you know, by this point, though, I'm so just moved by the entire experience that I'm simply lost in my own existential thoughts here. And, you know, whilst I sit there, my mind wanders to these incredibly bleak places, thinking about the really horrible ordeals that the people in recordings had to go through, the panic, the fear, the dread, and all the while you've got this drone and ethereal choir vocalizing over the entire thing, and it becomes this really profound experience that literally just fades out into nothingness. And yeah, with that, you have one of the bleakest and darkest albums I've personally ever come across, and it's one that, you know, it really shakes me to my very core in this very peculiar way. Even listening to it now, it has the same effects on me, and I find it very unusual. You know, I'll say here though, like, you know, I don't expect, you know, everyone watching this to go out and listen to this entire album and find themselves moved and upset in a weird, peculiar way. I think albums that can have that effect on you do so for whatever reason. It's never guaranteed. Like your experiences in life, your emotions and things like that, where you are in that particular place and time, can affect your approach and understanding of an album, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's just kind of like mere chance that these things can happen. You know, not everyone's moved to tears by the same things. So when I describe this as, you know, one of the bleakest and darkest albums, I'm sure you listening now could think of, you know, 100 albums that are bleaker and or darker, and, you know, in those instances you're probably right. But this album for me, based on my experiences, my, you know, what I've, you know, inherently taken out of it by listening to it and absorbing it, it's become the bleakest and darkest album that I've heard for my own reasons, and hence why I wanted to mention it on this show. It's been very difficult to talk about, but, you know, like, yeah, I just wanted to get it out there, to be honest, you know, get more people talking about this one, because it's very peculiar. So, yeah, this, you know, especially with all my pausing and stuff, I'm kind of getting overwhelmed talking about this one, but I'll keep pushing on anyway. I'd like to go into a bit more about the actual album itself, though. You know, by now we can see that it's a very harrowing, very uncomfortable album experience. You know, orchestral strings set against a backdrop of dark, foreboding drones and music concrete that has a narrative that progresses from track to track. And yeah, in spite of that, though, there's something that feels so wrong about it, though. You know, I guess that's the word for it. You know, listening to it, absorbing and experiencing it, you know, especially the use of those recordings. There's something that feels so wrong about that. And so, to sort of explain it a bit, I feel like it's actually best summed up by Patton himself, who actually explains it in the liner notes for this very album. And he explains that, you know, in his own words, there is something very genuine, and at the same time, very wrong in what I am doing. The recordings are very disturbing, but as we listen to these cockpit voice recordings, real people are about to die. I don't know why I'm doing something that feels so wrong, but I am. this work is disturbingly personal for me. The music is filled with ghosts and artifacts I couldn't erase. It is filled to the saturation point with a pathology that infects everything, of decayed memories haunted by the ghost of my brother who was killed in a plane crash. So, yeah, that's quite a bit of context there, to be honest with you, and I'll go back to it. In my original review for Echoes and Dust, I commented on the nature of those recordings, finding it really difficult to understand the rather invasive nature of how they made me feel when I was listening to them. And like I said, it is that focal point of the album. It's you know, it makes sense that Patton's exploring this idea, though, considering what he's experienced in his own life. You know, that, and as well, that line that explaining that it's filled with a pathology that infects everything. That, to me, really makes sense why this album is titled The Infected Mass. You know, it was something I experienced when I heard it, you know, back then in 2017. You know, mood is what it was prior to listening to it, but then by the end of it, you're made so uncomfortable, existential, and so downright bleak from the entire thing. And for me, it's so reminiscent of watching like Michael Haneke films, for example. You know, the stories occur, they go along their emotions and stuff, and you're just left with this really existential dread that lingers on for so long afterwards, you know? And I find it weird because it's not an experience people, you know, want to experience, but the fact that, you know, the album communicates it so easily and effectively makes it this incredibly powerful and emotive album experience. It's so unusual, though. And so, yeah, this is, without a doubt, this is a weird album. It's one that I would argue it toys with your emotions from time to time. There's elements of the unexpected and then, from what is established, the expected. And it seems that Patton kind of just subverts it on whim, you know. He gives it an almost randomness to the onslaught of emotions we experience when hearing this entire thing in one go. And to me, though, you know, that whole toying with emotions stuff, that whole, you know, randomness to it, I think there's some sense in that, though. You know, life itself is incredibly random, and things can just end up happening whether we want it to or not. And those events, you know, carry our emotions to these very weird and unusual places. And, you know, there's such an immense and heavy weight to the experience I get when I listen to this album. Hence why I want to discuss it on the show, despite it being a really tough album for me to articulate or even start discussing at all. And there are other reasons for that, but I don't really want to get into it today, to be honest with you. You know, I was going to go into sort of tirade about what else this album means to me, but I thought in doing so would really detract from what this album is meant to be about, you know. This is, you know, Patton sort of really expressing his own personal experience in this really, you know, uncomfortable way, in, you know, very difficult to approach kind of way. And, you know, that's the forefront of it all. Like, you know, regardless of our experiences, you know, what we get out of it is, you know, important as well and stuff. But yeah, I can only just begin to imagine how he was feeling when he constructed this entire album, because it's so devastating to me. Like, it really just gets to me every time. So yeah, with that one then, I think we're going to end today's episode of Weird Music. You know, this has been a really weird episode for me to dive into, but the experience of something like this is incredibly unique, you know, at least for me, and hence why I want to discuss this album on the show, you know. And when you get, you know, people talk about, you know, devastating proto-ambient-ish albums, you know, you hear The Caretaker, you hear William Basinski, you know, you hear those names get thrown around, but I never hear this album get thrown around, though. And as well, this was, you know, like, this was even an album that William Basinski himself described as devastatingly beautiful. You know, if the man who's known for making some of the saddest music out there describes it as devastatingly beautiful, then it really must be right. But yeah, there's an incredible obscurity to this one, though. You know, it seems to have sort of regressed into the history of Constellation Records without it ever really coming up again in any way or form. And I was always, as devastated as I was, back in 2017, I was really curious to see if Patton was ever going to follow up this album with anything else, but perhaps there was never any need to. The statement this album makes is, certainly enough of a thing, and I do hope that the creation of this album, I hope, and the release of it as well, I hoped it helped Patton find peace and solace, that he needed in dealing with such a heavy and immense ordeal, though. Very peculiar. But with that, though, I would like to thank you for watching today's, very unsettling, obscure and very obtuse episode of Weird Music today. And if you have any suggestions as well for other devastating and bleak albums, by all means suggest them in the comments. If I can, I'll see if I can muster the courage to write something about them. With that, though, I wish you all the best. I hope you take care. All the best, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.